Welcome to the very first Metaphoric Special. I'm Gabe.
I'm Dan.
We told you before that we've decided to change things up a little bit here at the Metaphoric, and instead of covering every BNT, BNM, BNR, and Sunday Classic of each week, we're going to focus on just the BNMs and drop a new episode every time we get 3. This is partly to make our schedule a little less demanding since Darren is having a baby, I think like in a couple days. But it also gives us a chance to do special mini episodes on classic albums, underrated new releases, requests, and yes, we have several in the queue. We will get to them very soon, I promise. Maybe interesting reissues, basically whatever else we want when things are a little slow, as they kind of are now. Sometimes Darren will join us, hopefully, but sometimes it'll just be me and Dan. So Dan, what are we going to talk about today?
Yeah, for the very first Metaphoric Special, we will be covering all 8 hours of Autechre's latest release, NTS Sessions 1 through 4.
Yes, this is a daunting undertaking. I think usually these episodes will be a little minier than this one will be because the amount of material is, I think, longer than most artists' entire discographies. But before we jump in, let's talk about why we picked this quote-unquote albums, whatever we want to call it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've mentioned it before on the podcast, but you and me are both like huge Autechre fans. And basically we would have talked about this anyway, so why not record it and make everyone else listen to it?
Yeah, I think so. I think we even, we talked about the last Autechre release, LSEC, on the podcast itself, somehow bullied Darren into listening to like 4.5 hours of Autechre back then, but he just doesn't have the time to double it nowadays. But yeah, I'm a huge fan, as are you. We'll talk about sort of the release of this record, but sort of unique release of this record. But I think we both spent like the past month listening to this a whole hell of a lot. So yeah, I think it was, seemed like a good idea. Just hit the record button before we start talking about it. So let's hear a clip and go over some background info.
You just heard a clip from the first album in the series, NTS Session 1. We'll try to play clips from the others later, but first, just some general background. As everybody probably already knows, Autechre is a UK electronic music duo consisting of Rob Brown and Sean Booth, who spearheaded the IDM genre of the 1990s with classic LPs like how do you say that one? Incanopula?
That's anybody's guess.
Yeah, whatever. Amber from 1994 and Tri Repute from 1995, as well as numerous equally legendary EPs, always known for their challenging minimalism and repetition. Autechre become increasingly experimental and borderline impenetrable as the years went by. By the time of 2013's Exi, however, the duo seemed to be onto something new. Instead of meticulously crafting abstract compositions, Autechre started recording live improvisations on various sounds and ideas and releasing their creations in mass, which led to Pitchfork calling them a post-human jam band. Indeed, Autechre seemed liberated by this stylistic development and released over 9 hours of live recordings on AE Live back in 2015, over 4 hours of new material on LSAC 1 through 5 in 2016, and now 8 hours of music on NTS Sessions 1 through 4, which is technically their 13th studio album and combines tons of new material with some reimagined pieces from those previous releases. Not much is known about the sessions themselves. After announcing a residency at NTS Radio on April 3rd, many expected more live music, but instead Autechre broadcasted 2 hours of studio material each Thursday of that same month and made digital downloads available immediately while opening pre-orders for LP and CD sets. We've talked a lot about our mutual obsession with Autechre, but what were your feelings about this when it first got announced?
Yeah, I was a little not like super caring initially. I mean, I remember when like AE Live got announced and, I think they did like one batch and then a little bit later or sometime later, they did another batch. And I was kind of like, I just didn't really get around to it until both batches were already out. And I was like, all right, this should be cool. I'm not like super looking forward to it, but I was kind of blown away. LSEC, I think seemed to come out of nowhere a little bit as well. And was really, really enamored with that. I think it made it on my pretty high on my end of the year list that year. But for whatever reason, when this was announced, I just thought it'd be more live stuff or something. And I feel like I didn't really start to get excited until people were talking about, the first session, and the second one was about to come out. I kind of, got into those. We'll talk more about this, but around the same time. But yeah, it took me a little while to kind of figure out, is this going to be new Autechre, or how excited should I be? What about you?
Yeah, I mean, when I first saw the announcement a couple days before the first one aired, I was excited, but I thought it was going to be a live thing, they were playing live in the radio station, which seemed cool, but not as cool as a studio recording. So yeah. I made time to skipped my nap, is what I mean, to listen to the first one live. Thought it was awesome. It was a lot of fun. Being on the Autechre subreddit and stuff, while everyone was discovering all this all at the same time, and it was just as soon as they put up those pre-orders, bought the LPs, and I was in basically from the beginning. I just when I found out it was gonna be 8 hours of music, I love anything that's just annoying to regular people, yeah. It's just the pure annoyance of releasing 8 hours of music appeals to me quite a bit. So I was pretty excited. But let's go ahead and get to our impressions. We'll start out with the first session. We'll do our best to keep them split up here. But what is your impression of NTS 1?
Yeah, so like I said, I didn't get to it when it first came out. I wasn't at the first live stream or anything like that. And, on the point you were just mentioning, once I started to figure out that this was new stuff, that this was studio stuff, I got really excited because, you called it it's exciting to listen to something that's annoying to other people. I guess in a way I feel the same, but I just love huge projects, mammoth projects. So then when I started to realize that this was going to be some enormous thing, with tons to dig through, I got really excited. So it was a little later. And I mean, on the first impressions, I, was just kind of wading through this 2 hours of material, and we'll talk more about it, but I think I was kind of in awe at the whole thing. I was a little bit still at that point trying to figure out what it was, but it's it sounds a little bit chaotic. Do the tracks have anything in common with each other, or is it just totally on shuffle, or what? We'll talk more about that, but what were you thinking about when you were listening to the live stream?
Yeah, I mean, right at first it just kind of blew me away. I thought, and this kind of happened with each of the first time I listened to each of these sessions. Just it was oh my god, that was the best thing I've heard. Just from the pure excitement of getting 2 hours of material from one of your favorite bands, for an entire month straight. There were definitely some certain tracks and stuff that really stood out from the get-go, but also the first listen through, and the first listen through of all the live streams, nobody knows what the track listing is. They didn't release that. Yeah. So you don't really know where one starts, one stops, or anything. But I was pretty in from the get-go. But I guess we can get deeper into it if you'd like.
Yeah, I think we should try to identify some standout tracks and try to break those down. But I mean, before we do, like I was just mentioning, do you kind of feel or and maybe we'll talk about this as a whole later, but at least in this first one, did you ever feel is this just a shuffling of tracks? Do you feel this thing NTS 1 is some kind of album? Because I always felt and maybe I'm crazy, but LSEC, it just hit us all at once, all 4.5 hours. Mm-hmm. And I worked really hard to kind of, think of them as separate albums, 5 separate albums, and digest them that way and start thinking about, okay, how do the two, 3 or 4 songs on this LSEC, kind of speak to each other? How do they reflect on each other, and took it in chunks like that. But this is, in a way it's chunks, but it's a 2-hour chunk. So do you feel there's some way, I want to sort of move toward describing the sound of this thing, but do you think there even is a sound of these 2 hours?
Yeah, I mean, that's difficult to do with any Autechre release, especially later stuff, I think. But one of these sessions seems much more cohesive to me than the other.
Yeah.
I guess I'll save it. That's a cliffhanger. But yeah, the first one kind of not. It does kind of just feel like, are these. And I don't want people to think I mean it as a lack of quality when I say this, because it's not what I mean at all. But are they B-sides? Are they leftovers from LSEC or XI or something? Are they just things that they had worked on and didn't finish, didn't fit on records? It doesn't really feel like they sat down and were like, we'll write 8 hours of music. Specifically for this, and especially, I honestly couldn't tell this much myself, but people on the internet and stuff that are more autistic than me figured out that some of this was like reimaginings from things in that AE live set and even some LSEC and whatever. So yeah, I'm not sure are some of these remixes or what,
Yeah, and on that note, so that's what I was sort of struggling with when I was listening to this first one, is like, is this just kind of a hard drive dump? And there are some things that make me feel that way and some things that don't make me feel that way. So for example, like the first track, right? T1A1. I think we're going to have a lot of fun trying to pronounce track titles on this episode. But it's really a weird opening song because it's kind of like the least eventful track and all of these sessions in a way, because it's like this plodding, extremely repetitive beat, and it just kind of like chugs along at almost like this half speed kind of feel. Toward the end, it gets into this like there's like a light change up as this kind of like nice synth kind of like fades in the background, these kind of like pad sounds that I think are like really breathtaking, and they're like little, very subtle changes. But it's a weird thing to like kick off 8 hours with. And then, we go right into this other track, BQ, and it's like a chiptune thing.
Yeah, that was like the craziest thing on the initial live stream, because the first one is kind of more Autechre. It wasn't like out of left field. It wasn't a huge shock that they were making something that sounded like this. But then, the slow plodding song kind of comes on, ends, and then we've got BQ, barbecue, and it just sounds like the weirdest like robot party or whatever chip tune is a. Yeah, it is. It's very cutesy. It really kind of like sounds like video game-ish. But like normally I would hate any sort of chiptune song. That's not a genre I enjoy. But it's like Autechre made the best, coolest chiptune track here.
Yeah, it's just strange. At first I was a little like put off by it, but I listened to it so much that I started to notice, like, again, kind of a similar trick that was in the first track, these like kind of warm pads and like weird harpsichord-y type sounds that come in that like add a lot of depth to what would otherwise be kind of like super, bleep bloop kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But, it's a strange transition. You said T1A1 is a little bit more in the world of Autechre, which I agree with, and yet it's like a lot less eventful than Autechre usually is. One thing I think that's challenging about Autechre is, especially kind of that middle period where they got like really abstract and meticulous, is that it's hard. Like you can't just like put it on and do stuff around the house. It's like you have to kind of like listen because it's so frantic and insane. And there's even stuff on LSEC, that's like that. But T1A1 had like this really kind of, it's a little clunky, but it's like a groove that is like really consistent, which I thought was strange. And for quite a long time. But then on the same note, jumping to the end of the album, this 32A Reflected, it feels like a closing track, right? Like
it does, yeah.
If the album felt like a weird assortment, it somehow, do you think that kind of ties it together? Like it makes it feel more like an album to end on a genuine closing track?
Yeah, and that's the thing that makes it so sort of hard to decide how to feel about this each of these sets individually. Is like there'll be things like T1A1 into BQ where it's just kind of that seems haphazard, whatnot. But then there seems like these obvious choices like 32A Reflected, and the last track for the entire sessions.
Right.
Like things like that, just like really kind of it kind of throws you for a loop. You don't know what to believe.
Yeah, after that like weird kind of opening 2 tracks, it's almost like we settle, in my opinion, into kind of a sound. And I guess like we're trying to describe the sound right now, but there's so much variation that it's tricky. But like this
really hard, yeah.
Debris funk, this like L3 control, and then a lot of this stuff happens in, I think, North Spiral and Gonk Steady and 4 of 7 as well, where they have like a more, I don't know, there's just like a really interesting use of this like kind of digital distortion, like glitchiness, but like kind of a whooshing, like almost, I don't know, use of like pure noise integrated into like kind of stuttering beats, but beats that are like kind of consistent in driving. I mean, I think like a constant theme throughout the whole NTS sessions, but especially with some of these tracks, which are some of my favorites, it almost feels like an idea, and then it's like, let's just build it in intensity as we go on. It adds like a cool human element. It's not just like, letting the machines run, which I think there are a couple tracks throughout the sessions that feel that way, but it feels like humans trying to build this thing. You know what I mean? It's almost got like some of these tracks have like a post-rock feel where it's like, let's just keep building and building and adding and building until it explodes or something.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, minus a handful of tracks here and there, it really doesn't sound like, the machine's just taking over. It definitely sounds like people manipulating said machines. But, there's a lot of like kind of sound exploration type stuff that I think Autechre, is known for. And, 32A Reflected, I don't know how someone figured this out. I guess you can kind of hear if you listen on nice headphones, but like the left channel and the right channel are the same exact thing, except reflected, like one's the opposite of the, like backwards.
In reverse,
playing it, but not like reverse where it sounds backward. It's just the exact same thing played in the opposite order. That's clearly like a choice. I don't think you arrive at that on accident.
Yeah, not by jamming do you arrive at that. And some of this, that's the weird thing about this set and all the sets here, is that some of it feels like kind of process music, which I'm a big fan of.
Yeah, me
I think
too.
Autechre does really well, where it's something like that. It's like this idea, like this concept that they sort of, just execute. And, we'll mention more examples of this, but others are like the total opposite, where it's just like, here's a sound or like a rhythm, and let's just actually jam it, like actually build it in like a live in studio kind of way. And those things play together really nicely, like on Carefree Counter Dronal on this track. This is another like example of where it makes you think like there's a method to all this. It's like a sort of interlude track, because we've just been sort of bludgeoned by some like really, huge washes of digital distortion on the previous 2 tracks, and then we get this kind of like, it is one of those things where it sounds like the machines are just running, because it's like it's like synths are playing, but they're being like interrupted by like sort of a pulsing, like kind of like the sounds dropping out and like being cut up in almost like a William Basinski way. But it's like a nice breather before we then launch into North Spiral, Gonk Steady 1, and 4 of 7, which are really extra driving and intense. I mean, on that note, though, we've at least mentioned every song here, but are there, is there like one or two that you find like your favorites from this set?
From this set, I really like BQ, BQ, BQ. Kind of,
wow.
The first time I listened to it, I kind of like how you said, I thought it was like a little strange and, maybe a little throwaway, but it's kind of grown on me. Like, I don't know, it's just so different that I really like it. But I also really like that 32A Reflected track.
Yeah.
I really love the idea of like process music and trying stuff like that out. And so it's just it's I like it for those same reasons. It like it inspires you or whatever, I guess.
Yeah. A lot of this set does give me that kind of like, if you're into making experimental music, as we are, it's like just the idea that they presented, not necessarily the exact sound, but the idea they presented on any one of these tracks is like really inspiring. On that note, I told you that I came to like, BQ more, but I think it's still one of my least favorite from the set because it's so jarring and strange there. I came to sort of adore T1A1, the opening track, because it's just like I was saying, kind of like a strange idea, just like this chugging, like slow rhythm where so little happens that like when like very small changes in kind of like these little glitchy sounds or these like white noise kind of sounds that sort of come in, and sometimes like this like really deep bass like kind of pops in at different points and stuff. We've talked about this when we've talked about a lot of minimal music, but when something is so repetitive and monotonous, like the tiniest changes feel huge. And when it kind of settles at the end into this, like, it gets like even more minimal, but now there's like a little organ sound. It's like kind of, it feels like a huge climax, but just with the quietest change possible. But okay, so on that note, we can keep referring back to these tracks, but let's hear a clip from NTS 2. So, by this point, I'm wondering, were you still listening to the live stream, or you're waiting for the proper quality? What was your first experience listening to NTS 2?
I didn't listen to the live stream for this one. The reason being is because I had pre-ordered the LP, so I got the downloads as soon as it finished. And
right.
This is gonna make me sound like a real dick, but the streams in 128.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not about that, I listened to the first one because, one, I didn't know it was in 128, and two, I didn't know if we were ever going to get this again. In fact, like, I had already, before they had put up the pre-order, I had already downloaded like a bootleg somebody recorded, on their computer, just hoping that these wouldn't be lost forever. But NTS 2, I knew I was going to have it as soon as it was done. I was going to have it in perfect quality. It was fun to talk on the subreddit like while it was happening, but it's more fun to hear it in 320. So I waited. What about you?
Yeah, I was still not. It was sort of like when this one came out that I became like fully aware of like, holy shit, we're getting 8 hours of new Autechre, and so I sort of had both of these first two to like really pay close attention to at that point. I didn't mention before, but I was basically working. Part of the reason, actually, why we missed a bunch of episodes recently is I was like working on this huge project for school, and especially these first two albums, became like my constant study music, and so this one and the previous one, I must have listened to like 100 times without not like super focus at that point, but just had them playing over and over again, and that's part of what we were talking about before. How like. Do you agree with me about this? That like they're not so frantic and like schizophrenic as Autechre often is. Like all of these releases seem to have like kind of a consistent drive to them that made it for me a lot more pleasant to like read and write to than most Autechre.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Because as these were coming out and whatnot, I kept going back and listening to like some of the old EPs and even some of the more recent ones. I listened to a bunch of those live things and stuff. And yeah, some of them I would it'd be nighttime. I would try to read while I was listening to those, and it just gets like so distracting. It's almost like when I try to read like with music that has a lot of like vocals, it gets like distracting. And some of those more frantic things get like that. It just kind of makes you anxious to like to like really try to lay there and relax and read while a computer's blowing up in your ears.
Okay, so talking about NTS 2, we had some trouble to describe the sound of NTS 1 because it's so all over the place, honestly. Even though there's some details that seem to imply that it's got like sort of a narrative arc and like musical flow throughout. How'd you do with this one? And, if we try to describe the sound, do you feel like there is a noticeable difference in like vibe or something from the first one?
I I don't think there's like a huge noticeable vibe between this one and the first one. The first one, because of the second track, BQ, it like that one jumps out so much, it sticks out so much that it, I don't think anything on this one like really feels out of place, but it also doesn't feel like, it's not like this one puts it to bed. Like, is this an album? Like, oh, it's definitely sounds like an album. It still sort of sounds like maybe it's a dump from leftovers or live things or whatever. But I think it's like a little bit more cohesive, I guess. I don't think I'm explaining that well at all. It's really difficult.
No, I agree a lot, actually. This one feels very cohesive to me, and flows in an interesting way. The first track, L Lick 97ers or whatever, is one of those more frantic ones, to be honest. It's almost like, it really sounds like a computer blowing up, like you mentioned before. And there's weird, like, I've never heard Autechre do this like so overtly, but just crazy, like, pew, 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 like explosions all over your head. and like kind of like bubbly, like, I don't know, slurpy sounds. Like it's almost like cartoony, but just like pure, like wires just sparking and glitching out for a good chunk of time, 10 minutes, and but it works because it's the opener. It's like, if it's a kind of weird outlier, because I think the rest of this sort of settles into more of these like driving intensity type grooves that we heard a lot of at the back half of the previous one. Because this is the opener, it doesn't like stand out. It doesn't like disrupt the flow. It sort of starts the flow, and then we settle in. And we'll talk more about this, but then we sort of, as the album goes on, we get like several, at least like, well, some of those tracks are very short, tracks 7 and 8, but we get like 4 or 5 like very ambient mellow pieces toward the end, which again gives it that like finality. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree with you. Do you think, I'll jump back just a little bit, but do you think like BQ, we keep talking about this, but would BQ like work better as the opening track of the first one than you think? Like, would it have the same effect as with ELY C9, where it's not, because I agree with you, it's not like very jarring because you haven't started yet, Do you think it would have the same effect in the other one?
I don't know. I think it would be like a sort of, just because of my taste, it would be sort of like a weak opener, and it would be like I don't know, it might sound even more out of place, because I think like the opening track of NTS 2, it sort of is like, here's craziness, and now we're like
slowing down.
Now it has like sort of a logic to it, but BQ, I don't even know what I'd do to make it fit because it's that kind of thing. But like you said, there's nothing like that really here, and I think there's some of like the most impressively like abstract stuff here. This NTS sound is like making so much use, like I said, of this like like really strange digital distortion and feedback. I mean, I don't even know like how I don't you don't know if it's like, is it real feedback? Is it like are they manipulating this? Obviously they are, but like these like it just straight up sounds like raw in like a post rock or like Swans kind of way, where like they're this human element where they are like just building the intensity until these things are like screaming and squealing. We hear like these feedback sounds on God, I hate the fucking song titles, Voik and like Nine Crow or whatever toward the end of the album. But that was like one of the coolest things to me. Did you kind of notice that like use of feedback and like pure, like a lot of distortion, especially on this one?
Yeah, this one is very noisy. And throughout like all the sessions, they do the kind of thing like where you like you have like a synth and you take the output and then put it back through the same like put it back through its own filters and everything, and it makes like that weird like crunchy. It's not the when people hear feedback, you think like that squealing, like when you hold a microphone next to a speaker or whatever. They use a little bit of that, but it also like this like synthesizer feedback, and I'm not sure if feedback is even the right word for that, but it just like makes this crunchy like. Yeah, it's got like a rock feel to it, even though it's not using the traditional rock instruments or even nothing really besides the like sort of sound of it. It's maybe a bad analogy, but
no, but it's interesting to me because they're sort of like creating this artificially, right, quote unquote, and yet it does have that kind of like rock element to it, because a lot of what's cool to me about like rock music is sort of like, I don't even know how to articulate this, but distortion, there's pedals and stuff for it now, but distortion is basically like a natural thing that happens to sound when you crank it too much. And like I love records where what you're hearing is like the amp. You're hearing like an amp buckle under the weight of the sound that is coming out of it. Like Sonic Youth is great about this. Swans, when you hear like just the pounding drums in Swans, like what's cool about it is not like the tone of the hit or whatever. It's like that human element of how hard it is being hit, and you hear like these acoustic instruments like sort of struggling to contain the sound and not break, right? And then sometimes people use stuff breaking, like feedback. I would sort of file under, this is the sound of something going wrong, right, in the physical world. And especially on this session, Autechre like is creating that sound, sort of manufacturing it, where when things are feedbacking and stuff, and like there's sometimes digital distortion that it sounds like an amp like blowing or something, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's something I don't think you get a lot in like electronic music.
No,
the amp isn't really, nobody's like, man, I wonder what amps Aphex Twin uses, because a lot of this stuff is just kind of recorded straight into a computer, or you just don't really put a ton of thought into the actual amps or whatever. But I don't know if they're actually recording amps or if they've just recreated this natural sort of sound unnaturally. Or I wish they would release something to say, revealing all their secrets, saying how they did this kind of stuff. But I guess I shouldn't hold my breath there. But just that kind of stuff is, I think, what's interesting about not only Autechre but like this style of music is like just trying to think of how it was made and how you would make these sounds. And they're just so, when you hear a band like a regular rock band, that's a guitar, that's drums, that's a bass, maybe it's like, what pedal was that or whatever, but there's like a handful of choices. There's like 10 different types of styles of pedal, whatever. With this, it could be one of a billion different things, and it's just it's super interesting to me.
Yeah, and going back to like that process music thing, I think sometimes they're playing with, like you can just tell the starting point was like an interesting sound that something made when filtered through this thing, back through this, like they were excited by whatever weird sound was created. And all of this stuff that we've been talking about kind of adds to this, like we called it like a rock feel, which feels weird to say, but there's something jammy and improvised and like human about this, which is so bizarre because Autechre has always been known for like that kind of cold, like mechanical, like this, you're just hearing machinery running after the world has ended and all the humans are dead or something. This is like the same sounds, but being controlled by like human intensity, which I think is so cool. And another thing on what you were just saying, when you think about like traditional instruments, I was trying to think of how to like articulate this. I'm going to fail, but like acoustic instruments, right? I guess electronic instruments kind of grow out of that, so people are like synthesizing sounds and they're not so different at first. Like these sort of synthesized drum sounds, are at first an attempt to recreate what drums sound like, and you kind of build like levels like that. Like, oh, here's like sort of the percussive sounds. Here's like sort of the, whatever the melodic percussive sounds that are kind of like keyboard or piano or whatever. We've got things that imitate strings that kind of give that lush pad sound. And, you kind of like, that's how it's built. And I feel like more than anybody, Autechre is so far past that. Like we are in like this completely abstract world. And it's amazing to me because this is really like a bizarre point that I don't think is going to make any sense. But, like if you, like some of the sounds on this, especially this session, which I think is my favorite, some of these are like just crushing sounds that just feel huge. Like I keep thinking about like one of my favorite tracks, Violvoik, or however the hell you say it, where like the bass, it goes back to that thing where it just sounds like as if the bass amp had completely blown, and now the thing sounds like a spring, like, and it's like, it just has this huge sound. Like the thing was so loud that whatever is trying to play it can't even handle it. And then there's other sounds that are like very light bell sounds, or like light touches on like a percussive instrument that doesn't in any way resemble any kind of drum you've heard before. And it'll be like way louder in the mix than that huge bass sound. It's just like so much of this album, I guess is what I'm trying to say, is a complete mindfuck where you're like, why is that very delicate, soft sound so much like, why is it totally overtaking that huge, mammoth, destroyed, distorted sound underneath? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I get you. I think that's what is like so great about Autechre, though. Like you said, the beginnings of synthesizing sounds, and still with most artists and bands and whatnot that use synthesized sound, you're like trying to imitate at least a few like real instruments, especially drums. Things always sound like a snare drum, sounds like a kick drum, whatever. But a lot of times on this, like you can like, sure, that should be the snare because of like where it's placed in the beat, and it's kind of got an abrasive feel to it. But if you heard that noise on your own, you wouldn't say, "Oh, snare drum," or bass drum. And then things like that, where to take this like mammoth sort of noise, like an amp being destroyed, and put that in the background, and put the tiny little fluttery bell sound or whatever in your face, is just like not disorienting. I don't think I personally wouldn't think to make that choice. I don't think, right. And I don't think most people would. But that's like what makes this special, and why. It's such an impressive thing that somebody could release 8 hours of music that people want to actually listen to, and things like that, I think, show you like why.
Yeah, so much of this album is completely like, it's just dizzying how like, I don't know, you're just in another dimension or something like that. On that note, I mentioned like this Violvoik song, track 6 is like one of my definite highlights. 9 Crow, track 11 is another one that I like adore because it's one of the most like just destroyed sounds here. You have any favorites from this set?
Yeah, I like super love X Flood, the third track. That thing gets spooky. That is like a real spooky song. Autechre doesn't like really do the whole spooky thing that much. But they did it here, and just the first time I heard that song, I was like, man, that's a highlight, and it stayed that way throughout the month.
Yeah, I think like a lot of this whole entire set is much more menacing than I've ever heard Autechre be. Another point I wanted to mention real quick is the on that same note of like playing with your head. There's a lot of cool use of like I remember remembering this now from T1A1 from the previous previous session, where like how sometimes they'll just like let reverb kind of like fill in all of a sudden, like the sound was relatively dry, and then like on one hit or something it'll have all this like this huge expansive reverb, and it's just like you thought you were listening to something kind of like dry and almost like suffocating in a way, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh damn, there's like a huge space underneath this track. It's so hard to like describe in words what they're doing here, but I think there's just like, these are just like masters of sound. And the other thing I want to mention before we move on real quick is the closing track here, Turbile Epic Casual Stipple Idle, is like a huge 20-minute. This is one of these things, right, where it sounds like they're just letting ambient sounds and loops and stuff go, right?
Yeah, it's like, did they step out of the room? It's, all these sets are exactly 2 hours, like on the nose. Yeah. And I wonder, like, is it just, did they use stuff like that to make it exactly? Because you could cut this 5 minutes before, or 10 minutes after it's cut. So I wonder if that's like the choice behind that.
Yeah, it sort of foreshadows what's going to happen on the last NTS session we'll talk about later, where it's not easy to listen, but it's such a like cool outro. Like after all of this like audio destruction, these things are just running on their own. But all right, let's hear a clip of NTS 3.
So NTS 3, what were your first impressions of this? Were you live streaming it? Were you waiting for the real MP3s? What?
Yeah. This one I actually did live stream and followed along with the live thread. By the time that this one came out, I had finished that huge project that I had been working on, and I had like gotten to do close listens of the first two. And at that point, I mean, I was excited. I mean, I think like the first one, like we've kind of said, is it just made me think like, wow, this is going to be a lot of Autechre, and Autechre is great. But then by the second one, I was like, this is like something new and exciting even for Autechre, and I just cannot wait for this third one. So I listened along with the live stream, and that was like a blast. Talking to people, everybody's just so excited, and it's kind of fun. Like you don't know how long the tracks are going to be. Like you're saying, you don't know what they're called, and we haven't really mention, which maybe we should spend a little time talking about, just how long these tracks are. Obviously each set has to be 2 hours, but like tracks are often 20 minutes, often 15 minutes. But before we jump into that, I mean, what were you doing when you listened to this one for the first time?
Yeah, again, I had the MP3s waiting for me as soon as it finished, so I waited, now listening to 128, and and picked it up then. But I still the whole time I kept looking at the like live stream thread, even though I wasn't here, just trying to see what I could imagine, whatnot. And then even when I had the MP3s and I went back and like looked at the thread from the beginning, and it's like fun. You can tell like what track people are talking about and stuff, and it's just it's just like that's one of the best things about the internet is like the like communal listening experience.
I know,
like
I miss that.
I know it used to be, and maybe it's just because I'm older and don't hang out super late at night on the internet as much anymore, but like when an album would come out, and just everybody would hear it at the same time, and I mean I like forever will remember like waiting for when Godspeed like released Alleluia, just like at a show, and no one knew, like just waiting all night on Mew for somebody to get home from the concert and upload it, and staying up till 4 or 5 in the morning, like doing that. That kind of stuff is just like a lot of fun. But yeah, that's basically what I was doing.
Yeah. I as just a side note, I totally missed that. I loved the rollout of this record, especially with so much music. Getting like a 2-hour chunk every Thursday was genuinely so exciting. Like it was like the most, people, I don't care as much about it, but people got excited like how, something like Lemonade by Beyonce was like a live event. Like everybody tuned in at the same time and talked about it at the same time. And like, that just feels like it's missing from music. But okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about the track lengths, but we should also try to describe the sound of NTS 3 and decide if it's different from the previous two. But yeah, isn't it kind of weird how like on any other release, basically, like a 10, 15-minute track would feel like a huge kind of centerpiece. But on all of these sessions, those are kind of like the shorter ones, and they're just like surrounded by, obviously, like when they cross the 20-minute mark, that starts to feel like one of those juggernaut centerpieces. But each release seems to have a handful of them. I mean, it's kind of weird, right? Like the shortest thing is like, I don't know, 7-8 minutes. Yeah. The shortest one is 6 minutes and 59 seconds. So, and there's only 2 tracks under the 8-minute mark. It's a weird thing, like you said, normally those post 10-minute tracks feel so huge, but they're the shorter interlude type things on this set.
I was really thinking it's because, these are getting released on vinyl. LSEC didn't get any sort of physical release whatsoever, and a lot of tracks on that are like super long, and just the order of them like wouldn't make any sense for vinyl and whatnot. And so I was thinking like here, okay, they've given themselves this cutoff of 23-ish minutes, which is like a comfortable place to stand on vinyl. Of course, the next set sort of blows that out of the water a little bit, but up until this point, if only 3 has come out, like I kind of felt like, are they not only writing these for this radio thing or dumping them for this radio thing, but I felt like there was some sort of care in the track listing, like to fit on a physical release. I guess they fit nicely on CD too. I can't do that as easy in my mind as a record.
Yeah, I started to think like that like a similar thing. Like, God, it feels like a huge hard drive dump at some points. Maybe these things are going to make a lot more sense when they're divided into individual records. Like it would be like a 2 to 3 songs, kind of like LSEC playing off of each other, maybe. But yeah, obviously we'll talk about it. But the next one kind of fucks that all up. But let's try to think about the the sound of this one. I think this one's a little different from the previous two, because the previous two used a lot of that like distortion, feedback, blowing amp sounds, and I feel like a lot of that is missing from here. Do you agree? I mean, do you think this one has a cohesive sound?
Yeah, I think it is like a little softer and whatnot. And now that I'm thinking, this just crossed my mind right now. How we've sort of talked like the first one, second one, they kind of like start and get to a natural progression of an end. Do you feel like maybe that's why this one to me sort of feels like a little bit like the middle? Is there some more thought to this? Is it like one big thing, and we are just kind of in this middle section here? Because I think this one, I like it a lot and stuff, but this is kind of the one that when it was over I didn't think like this is the greatest thing I've ever heard. I thought like this is one of the greatest things I've ever heard. Just slightly, I was slightly less like impressed right off the bat with this one. It felt like a little bit like the middle. I wonder if there's something to it.
Yeah, it is interesting because obviously like the next one sounds like 2 hours of closer, to the whole project. And it does kind of feel like that. It's a weird one here. I think it's the weirdest of the sessions because there are a handful of like the most, I hesitate to use the word conventional, but for Autechre standards, the most conventional tracks of the whole set are here. And then some of the weirdest are also here. And they just kind of like are mixing together. So like, the Clustro Casual, the first track, it's kind of got like a pretty straightforward groove, and it's got like a nice, I could just imagine like, I don't know, Black Dog Productions or something kind of like doing a, off that, like, what's that, Remus album or whatever. But, like sort of a, it's still got that like kind of, abstract thing, but it felt more firmly in like this IDM world of this kind of groove. A little bit later, that's track FLH is almost like the chiptune vibe again. Yeah. But like a much more standard, like kind of electro, like Daft Punk on the Tron soundtrack kind of thing all of a sudden. The next couple tracks, one of my favorites, track 6, Gloss Ceramic, starts kind of like that. Like it almost plays off FLH pretty well because it starts kind of like that and just seems to like disintegrate. But we have a couple really weird detours, like Acid Moine Idol, which is like this single chord, like, and like these kind of like almost comical, like weird foresty sounds and like chirps and stuff. It's a pretty all over the place thing, right? Yeah,
this one kind of feels the least amount of cohesive, and I think it's on this one. I can't remember now. Maybe you can remember. Like one song like sounds a lot like Boards of Canada.
Yes, actually, it's one of my favorites.
Is it on this one?
G1E1. Yeah,
it is. Yeah. G1E1. Yeah, like it felt a lot like Boards of Canada, not in like a ripping off kind of way, just kind of in a oh, it'd be cool if Autechre did a Boards of Canada song.
Yeah.
And it worked. But yeah, I mean, like, it doesn't really, the rest of the record doesn't sound like that. And yeah, this one just sort of feels like the middle a lot to me.
Yeah, I mean, and like that G1E1 is another highlight for me. I think it's so weird. Like, it does sound sort of like, it really kind of does sound like if Autechre was doing Boards of Canada. So it's like, imagine like how instantly lovely Boards of Canada sounds with these kind of like warbly, like wavy, lo-fi kind of synth sounds, and then just like as fucking weird as that could possibly be with more of that like reviving kind of feedback, like weirdness, like just decaying distortion sound, but like really mellow and really minimal. I had the weirdest experience where like I was listening to this in my car really loud, and I swear to God, as the track goes on, like it just started to sound like it was only coming out of the back speakers. Like I don't know how the fuck this thing is made, but it's just like
you got the quadraphonic mix of the record.
I don't know. It's like just the sound of it was so weird that like eventually I was like, it felt like it was getting farther and farther behind me. Like by the end, I was like, the car behind me is playing it. Like I swear to God, this whole record is such a mindfuck. But yeah, some like goofy tracks. I mean, what do you think of that Acid Moine Idol? I think that's another one where like the idea is cooler than the actual sound. Like just like sort of a intermittent bursts of a chord with like bubbling sounds around it.
Yeah, I agree. I like it. Like when it first starts, I'm always like, oh man, this track, this is like a badass thing. And then I'm like, oh yeah, it's really not 12 minutes.
Yes,
great, like it overstays its welcome a little bit. It
feels like process music again.
Yeah. And yeah, I think it just like overstays its welcome quite a bit. And I wonder, is that because that one and the next track, FLH, like make a side of vinyl, basically, like what they're at. So is it 12 minutes because they needed 12 minutes for it? Like that's another spot that kind of makes me think like the times were picked. And
don't they feel like those two tracks have like nothing to do with each other? It's like,
no, yeah, they don't like, flow or sound similar. Yeah, there's not really like a ton of similarity between those two.
Totally bizarre. But I gotta say, I guess we should talk about like some of our favorites from this record, because I think some of the best tracks of the whole session are here as well. I mean, I mentioned Gloss Ceramic and G1E1. Gloss Ceramic has the weirdest, like, it sounds like a sample of a cymbal, or maybe even a synthesized cymbal sound, but it gets like completely fucked with as the second half of the track goes on. But I gotta say, like, Nine Fly and Ikari, the closing track.
iCarly.
Is there an L up in there?
No, it's
you're making jokes. Okay. I was about to like be stunned if they made an iCarly joke, but it's the first NTS session that doesn't close with something ambient.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like a very like spacious, slow, minimal kind of like, I don't know. I don't even know how to describe it. It sounds like if you're like dumping a bunch of broken machinery like in slow motion, and just like the sounds that it's making. I mean, like there's huge space between it. It just sounds like if it was any slower, the song would fall apart and it would just become like a series of unrelated noises. But I think it's like unbelievable, but maybe doesn't feel that much like a closing track.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It doesn't really feel like a closing track, and I think that's another thing that makes me feel like this is the middle record, is because of that. But that track is great, and what you said about like it, if it was any slower, it would fall apart. That's another thing that's great about these sessions and Autechre is like so often like everything is just on the verge of being just noise and unlistenable, or something, they like skirt that line to the very edge. But I think for me, G1E1 I think is the highlight here, basically for the reasons you listed, and it's just cool to hear Boards of Canada through the lens of Autechre.
What about, I think we would be remiss not to talk about TT1PD, which a lot of people are calling their favorite track of the set. I mean, this to me is the most post-rocky, the most like Swans-esque or something, where it just seems to, I mean, it's like the most, it just feels fast paced, like driving energy, and it just builds and builds like in this intense, like slow burn until this kind of shift happens, and it feels kind of like a car eye or whatever, where it just slowly falls apart over the last 10 minutes. But it's got such a like fire underneath it. I mean, that track is definite highlight, right?
Yeah, I think that one is like the most Swans-esque, if we want to talk like that. They do that whole thing where it's like, it's maybe sort of a normal song, and then it builds and builds and builds and builds and collapses like that.
Yeah.
And this is like the electronic version of that. That track is very good.
Yeah, definite highlight. But okay, let's hear a clip from the last session, NTS 4.
All right, NTS4, the last one. What were you doing on it? You live streaming it again?
No, I was, like you on the previous one, I think, I was like, I had to get like my oil changed or something, but I was just reading the live thread without listening to it. And of course, we'll talk about what, the fun twist of NTS4, but, just reading people's reactions, like, and having a lot of fun because there seemed to be a ton of confusion about this one. What were you doing on the first listen?
Yeah, basically the same thing as the other ones. Waiting for those 320s and reading along with the live thing, especially that twist at the end.
Yes.
People speculating how long that had gone on for. I saw somebody that said it was at least I think it was like an hour and 15 minutes or an hour 20 or something.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff was pretty funny.
Yeah, so we should describe it because this one has a lot more of a cohesive kind of vibe than the previous one. So how would you describe the sound of this record?
Yeah, this is the one, in the first one, my little cliffhanger. I think this one is the one that sounds like the most cohesive. This is like ambient Autechre.
It's an ambient record.
It's an ambient record, yeah. And not only because of that last track, All End, which is just 58 and a half minutes of straight, unabashed ambientness. But I think exactly. But I think this whole record is that. This one sounds like a record. Almost even, some people have been like reticent to does this count as like the 13th Autechre record? Like, Is it just a compilation? Is it a live thing? Nobody knows. But I kind of feel like this one is, if you counted one as a record, this one would be it. Yeah,
I think that makes a lot of sense, and it's remarkable. I mean, it's like Autechre has never released an ambient record before, and it's something that a lot of people wanted them to do. I remember on the subreddit, just a lot of people before this came out saying like, I hope that the last one is like pure ambient or pure drone or something. They totally got their wish. And yet, reading the live stream, people are like, wow, what the fuck? Like, I guess we're getting 2 hours of pure ambient and stuff like that. There's a lot of like interesting pulses and stuff in almost all of these tracks, except for All End, that makes it, I think, very, I don't want to use the word accessible, but if you're at least like, if you're wary of, Autechre ambient, what that's going to sound like, at least these first three tracks, they have like a drive and like a pulse to them. You know what I mean? Yeah.
I mean, like, if you somehow are okay with Autechre but afraid of ambient and minimalism and stuff, I think you'll be safe here. It really does ease you in to All End.
Yes.
There's drivingness and whatnot. There's just always like a little bit of space that seems to get larger and larger as we go towards All End.
Yeah, and column 13 is, to me, a definite highlight of the whole sessions, and it's like genuinely very pretty. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think my favorite track on this, and probably my favorite track of the whole sessions, is the next one, Trim Ripple Casual, however you want to say that. That's just like basically the raddest like sound exploration. It's kind of got like a little bit of everything we've gotten from these sessions. You know, there's like this. The background is like this kind of driving but droney like string like chords,
like loops.
Yeah, and then just like what seems to almost be just random sounds happening, but enough of a system to it that it's not falling apart and it's not.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound random. You know, it's again like skirting that boundary of like just random sounds.
Yeah. I love that one too a lot. Like it sounds like, it's kind of like the last track on NTS session 2, where it was just like 20 minutes of which it sounded like things running, like loops and stuff running their course, or just like machines kind of on their own. It's like there's a bed of that, and yet on top of it, it almost sounds like people playing, like two people actually jamming, but instead of like sounds, or like instead of like instruments, they're using like, I don't know, the sound that a amp makes when it's being turned on or something, like glitchy kind of strange buzzing sounds.
It doesn't really feel like somebody's playing an instrument. Not that, much of Autechre does, but like it doesn't really sound like somebody's sitting at a synth or even like a modular system or anything. It really sounds like sampled noises, from synthesizers and like glitchy things. We'll never know what the sounds are made of, but it sounds like some of the sounds like seem organic but like messed with. Some like definitely feel completely like inorganic. It's just like it's a crazy track that every time I listen to it, I feel like I hear something new.
Yes.
And it's just like, it's like one that I feel like I want to study and I want to rip off every time I make a track from here on out.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting track. It's amazing that after, at this point we've listened to like 7 hours of Autechre over the course of a month, and especially with this track, it's like amazing. There are like these huge surprises, but nothing really tops the surprise of the next track, like we've mentioned. I was going to say this Shim Ripple Casual sounds like so not music that it's like the end of music, but of course the end of music actually comes after that track with All End, which, like you mentioned, is about an hour of basically a sustained chord. It's got a lot of like Tim Hecker kind of comparisons. I might bring up like Basinski a little bit, but how would you describe this track?
Yeah, I mean, it basically sounds like somebody holding a chord for 58 minutes, but somehow more interesting than that, in the sense that it's messed with a bit, in a very Tim Heckery way. Really, like, moments of it sound a lot like Harmony and Ultraviolet, which is, peak tier Tim Hecker. But like you said, Basinski, I completely agree with that. There's times in the song or track, whatever you want to call it, where the sustained chord, it sounds like it was on a tape and the tape screws up or glitches or stuff, which of course,
like disintegrating.
Basinski's most famous for disintegration tapes, which is that exactly. So it feels like this sort of weird amalgamation of Tim Hecker, Basinski. I think this one, it feels the least like Autechre. The loop sound is not an Autechre sound. It's like kind of the most organic sound on the whole record. It just sounds like a organ or a synthesizer. It doesn't sound like a otherworldly instrument. It sounds inorganic, but organic enough that you're used to of hearing that in normal music. Does that make any sense?
Sort of. I mean, we should say that. So basically, at the end of Splesh on the previous one, NTS 3, you get like a weird, just like a couple seconds of like this sort of chord comes in, like this big lush synth chord, and it's it comes from the 9th track on XI, which is Blade Loris, or however you want to pronounce it. And so people were like kind of joking about like, hey, it's weird that like that track that is really a highlight of XI sort of gets like a little shout out at the end of Splesh. And then it turns out that same lush chord becomes like the basis for this final hour of the NTS sessions. And it's like this huge lush synth chord that they've used before. In my mind, like, I listened very closely today, and I wanted to tell you actually that, I like to do this thing where like when I'm listening to music really closely, especially like kind of instrumental or experimental music, I like to like throw on like a silent movie and just watch it and see when things match up. So I watched Metropolis for the first time today.
Oh, good, yeah.
And I gotta say, like, this track, All End, was so cool because it matched up like with basically the end. They're like an extra like 15 minutes or something, but the end of the film, which was really fucking awesome, I gotta say. But listening to it that closely, with my nice headphones on, there's like a lot going on. You mentioned like sort of these disintegrating moments. There's moments where like it's almost like it's like low pass filtered or something, and it just becomes like almost like it's gonna go away, but then kind of like it just sounds like buried, like it's now underground, this drone, and it's gonna come back up, almost like a Gas, who we've talked about before, Wolfgang Voigt, enters that territory. And there's like this weird cello-y sound, like a cello or like a groaning sound that actually changes notes and stuff like that throughout. It's a really slow, drawn-out melody, but there's sort of a melody to this. A lot of people are debating, like, are they just holding the same thing? Is it stuck? Is this just going to be like, a loop at the end of the, what do they call that?
A locked groove. Locked groove, yeah.
Yeah. No, it like really evolves and changes like in really subtle, interesting ways, kind of like the very first track of the whole sessions did, T1A1, but on a much grander scale. One thing I think we got to address, a lot of people are calling this, it wouldn't be fair to say it's like Autechre's greatest moment or something, but it has this huge feeling of finality, and it feels like it just closes this monster set in like such a magnificent way, maybe the only way you possibly could. But a lot of people got worried about the song title, All End, like AE, which is like the, Autechre. Are you worried at all that like this might be the last thing we hear from Autechre?
I don't know. I think, it's like, I think they mean it for the sessions, You're doing a 4 set of 2-hour things. The track titles, most of them seem like just a way that they seem like file names, especially they're never like capitalized or anything. It's kind of just like little things that you can tell like mean something to them, and they know it that it, like a lot of things have this like dronal or I think there's a couple of like gonk things, the shrimp roll or whatever is repeated a couple times. I feel like maybe they were like, that one's got to be the end track, so we'll call it All End. They just don't seem like the kind of people who are going to retire from doing this. I read some interviews or whatever. They did like a AMA on Reddit. I think it was a couple years ago, and somebody posted, or maybe it's on the sidebar, the Autechre subreddit or something, like all the questions and answers of that. And I was just kind of reading through it, bored one day, and like, in one of them, they like, or maybe this was an interview, but it was one of these things. They like basically say that like all that they do is like make sounds in a studio, and like they were like, if we like have to go a day or two, like I get anxious, like, and it just that's not the kind of thing that sounds like somebody's like, that's it, I've had enough of making weird noises. So I just really like nothing about them or anything like seems like it'll end, except for them being like really old, and they're not, even though they've been doing this for like 30 years or something, which is,
I know,
it's like
consistently good.
I know, it's
like
insane.
30 years. Yeah. Okay. So I'll just say that I hope not. Like, of course, it worries me a little bit, but I just really, really hope not, because they do sound like on the very top of their game. All right, so our mini episode here is turning into as long as a regular episode.
I knew it would.
Yeah, but it's a lot of music. But I wrote down like a bunch of questions here that were kind of like if we didn't get to them yet. So maybe we'll just sort of rifle through these. If a gun to your head, you had a gun to your head, what are you calling this? An album? An anthology? Like 4 albums? What is this?
Oh, man, I don't know. It's so hard because like I would say I would pick album. Because, like I said, like 3 feels like the middle. There seems like it goes from a lot of activity to no activity with All End.
Yeah.
But then again, they're selling it separately. You know, you wouldn't have, you know, they don't sell the second disc of The Wall on its own, you know.
Right.
That's 2 discs, right?
Yeah.
You know, you don't really do that. But then again, maybe the record label is making them or something. Honestly, though, I think that if you ask them, they probably... I kind of feel like they're just past... They're post music, they're post record, post...
I kind of felt that way too, right? Like, this is like the end of the album. Like, you know, I've been waiting forever for somebody to take advantage of that. You know, Autechre kind of has been, but, you know, albums can be any length you want now. And yet it's so interesting that it seemed like, at least for the first 3 sessions, that they were kind of like deliberately limiting themselves to sides of vinyl, like a track listing that would make sense on LP. Of course, the last one fucks that up completely because the last track is like an hour long. It's going to have to be cut or abridged or something.
It'll have to be on 3 sides. Just the way that 4th one works out to be on 3 records, it'll be over 3 sides of vinyl. Yeah.
So clearly that wasn't entirely their concern. I mean, even Shim Ripple Casual, the previous track, is like 25 minutes.
It's 24 and a half, which fits on a side, but that's definitely pushing it. Yeah, you really shouldn't try to go over 22. But yeah, I wonder, you know, when they're making this, we're like, yeah, sure, we can do 8 hours, and they're like, oh fuck, man, we got 58 minutes left.
yeah. I don't know. It's really strange. It feels like it's all these things at once. Like, it's totally the end of the album. Like, it's just track lengths don't matter or whatever. It's like a hard drive dump in the best way possible because it's a hard drive dump by one of the best bands ever. And yet it also has like a weird narrative arc, both within each album and to the whole project. Mm-hmm. It's like, it's restricted in some ways to vinyl and then some ways definitely not. It's really weird. And, you know, on that note, I don't think any like Autechre fan would ever say this, but, you know, do you think it's too much? Do you wish there was more editing on this?
No, not at all. You know, and I don't say that just trying to be pretentious or cool or something. Like, I really enjoy that this is so like mammoth. You know, I don't. Yeah. Like, I liked it about LSEC. LSEC seemed a little, you know. I don't come back to LSEC as much as I think I'll come back to these NTS sessions. It's just so mammoth and like gigantic.
So much to explore for years to come.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you know, if it takes them 2 years, 3 years, whatever, to release another record or anything, like, I'll still be going through this one and finding new things and stuff. And I think that this style of music, you know, it's about like sound exploration, and when they give you 8 hours to explore, I think that's more interesting than 45 minutes or 60 minutes or whatever. So I do not think it's too much. What about you?
Yeah, I don't at all. I mean, I think that this almost like I don't want to say fixes the problems, but it sort of like improves upon, you know, the last couple of releases in almost every way, because I felt like on XI, I mean, that record was 2 hours, mm-hmm. And yeah, I felt like sometimes the tracks were like getting cut off too soon. It had like sort of a jarring. You
didn't get to breathe.
Yeah, it didn't. A lot of people complained about like that one record, Choristus, or however you pronounce it, mm-hmm. Because it's kind of a weird album where it's almost like 20 short ideas, and then of course they released like multiple EPs that were like way longer than the record itself, where they were kind of like actually building on those ideas and reimagining them and stuff like that. You know, both that and XI, yeah, they didn't have that like room, and here they've got almost like all the space they want, and yeah, it's sound exploration. I love like just, you know, forever you'll hear things that you never heard before. You mentioned that you like this better than LSEC. I mean, I think I do too, because for the reasons I just said, that there's so much more to explore here, and some of like the highs are way higher than I think the highs of LSEC, even if it's not like as consistently good. But you're prepared to say that NTS sessions 1 through 4 is greater than LSEC.
Yeah, I think I am, and I agree. I mean, I love LSEC and whatnot. And yeah, maybe it's a little more cohesive or whatnot, but this one, yeah, the highs of this NTS session are the highest of Autechre's career.
Yeah,
you know,
I agree.
and the lows of this like aren't that low, you know. If the worst or the best thing I ever recorded was half as good as the worst thing on this set, I'd be pretty damn happy, you know. So I think so.
Yeah.
Just the scope of it, the breadth of it, everything about this is like exactly what I want in Autechre.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, we've talked about a lot of minimalism and stuff on this podcast, and a lot of it, we talked about like the well-tuned piano, Lamont Young, like a lot of it.
It needs it needs
to
that
be huge.
Yeah, that's what I think. Minimalism is especially like something like well-tuned piano and stuff, like the repetitiveness is just like, if you take something, you make it like repetitive for 5 minutes, that's just annoying. If you repeat something for 3 hours, now it's like it becomes like this new thing. That sounds like super pretentious, but
no, it's true. And then it's never like rarely is it directly repeating, but it's like these subtle changes that evolve over time.
And that's the kind of stuff that you get to explore and find. I listen to the the Disintegration tapes all the time.
I know.
And still, you find like little moments, and that is literally just a loop of tape you're listening to for
Yes.
Hours and whatnot. And you just find these little things, and there's just so much to be like rewarded with it in this.
Yeah. All right. So we talked plenty, I think, about whether these individual sessions have like cohesive identities of their own, which I think was sort of a cool thing, like I mentioned about LSEC. Less of a thing here, and yet they kind of do. But I want to ask, like, well, first off, have you looked at the Rate Your Music scores of these records? If not, I want to quiz you.
I have, but like as I listened to them like a week or when they first came out, I haven't looked since.
Okay.
I always put my own scores on, so.
Oh, I see. Okay, so what do you think is the highest rated of the NTS sessions right now?
Probably number 2.
Very close. I think it was until recently, but it's actually 3. That is.
Oh, really? Because that was the one we were sort of the least hot on.
Yeah. That's kind of surprising to me. And then 2 comes next. What do you think is after that?
I think 4 is going to be the last one, so it's 1 and then 4.
Actually goes 4 and then 1.
Oh,
1 is the...
I don't know shit.
By quite a wide margin, it's the least favorite. So how would you rank the NTS sessions?
I mean, I think number 4 is the best. By far. Then I'd probably put number 2, then 1, then 3. So 4, 2, 1, 3. What about you?
I think 2 is like definite favorite. I think next I would have to go. It's really hard. I think I would have to go like 1, 4, and then 3. But those last.
Yeah, it's so hard.
The last 4 on that list are very, very close to each other. I'll just say that. But all right. I guess we've gone on long enough. I was going to ask, if Autechre isn't over, which, pray to God they aren't, are there any tracks here that you see as being like indicative of the future Autechre sound? Maybe that's too hard to answer, but do you kind of hope that the next release is like 16 hours long?
I don't know. 16 hours might be a little bit too much, but I hope they stay with this post album sort of. Don't limit yourself because of and it's a little weird to say that because this is getting released physically, but I hope they stick with this like being free of it having to fit places or people only listen to an hour record or something. I hope they continue to not care about that. If what they want, is a 60-minute record and that's all the room it needs to breathe. Like I don't think Tri Repete seems stilted in any way.
Right.
Then good. But if it's songs that need to breathe, I would rather have 16 hours of Autechre that got all the room it needed than a shorter, more digestible release.
Agreed. I guess we've come to the end of our first mini episode, which is not so mini at all. But,
it was a bit of a bit brave on us to pick an 8-hour record as our first mini
but
episode.
we did it.
We did it without Darren too. Am I not? But for next show, we've got one B&M so far. Sleeps the Sciences. So as soon as we get 2 more of those, we'll give you another regular episode. Maybe we'll have a special in between that. We don't really know. So subscribe. Do that on iTunes, any podcast app. You can listen in the browser, metaphoricmusic.com. Email us, metaphoricmusic@gmail.com. Stay connected. Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, all that junk. It's at Metaphoric Music, and we'll see you next episode.
See ya.